Ever since I was a little girl, I remember hearing the story of my father's flight from Prague. It seemed like a wonderful adventure, but I really did not appreciate its value to my father. As the years passed, and the story was ever the same, repeated at every suitable occasion, I began to understand that it was an integral part of my father's life, indeed, a high point of his youth. In 1978, when I went to Lithuania for the first time, it was still a very restrictive communist state. During my trip, I went to the building where my parents had lived in Vilnius during the war. My mother had told me about their apartment, that it had been very beautiful and spacious. I realized that I actually had an old photograph of it. I visited some of the other places where my father had spent time. Trakai, where he had a boat. The park in Kaunas, where he used to go for walks with my mother when he was courting her. And Laisvės alėja, the main concourse where they used to stroll on Sunday afternoons. The Metropolis, the most expensive hotel in Kaunas, where my father would invite my mother for dinner. I met many of my relatives, including my father's brother and sister. They welcomed me with songs and a lot of champagne because I was the first of their relatives to visit from the United States. My aunt gave me my father's album, which she had kept safe and hidden for 34 years. On the album, there were 9 medals and insignia of various aviation clubs and associations. As I turned the old pages, I discovered photographs depicting his flight and landing, photographs of his plane, of the crowd at the airfield awaiting him. Then the story became real to me. After my father died, I began to think that I should somehow immortalize it. He had been so young, so brave, and so daring. At first, I thought about writing a book, including his memoirs, but then the idea of a film was suggested to me by some friends. I bought a very good professional camera, but actually had no idea as to how to make a film. One day, I asked my friend Marita's husband, Fred Murphy, if he would film for me. He agreed. Fred was an extraordinary cameraman who had also won an Academy Award for one of his films. We first went to all the locales in Brooklyn where we had lived as immigrants, the 2 neighborhoods, Williamsburg, Bedford-Stuyvesant, to Sheepshead Bay, where my father used to like to go fishing, and past Floyd Bennett Field. And then came the problem of the filming of the actual flight. It had to be done in Prague because that was the origin of the flight. Where to get an antique plane and some cameramen in Prague? Again, through my friend, I was given the name of a woman in Prague who said she would find me a cameraman. Everything was still very vague to me, but I made my travel arrangements, and on July 10th, 2007, I arrived in Prague, full of hope and excitement, just as my father had done 75 years before. Prague was just as beautiful as my father had said. It had been miraculously spared during the Second World War. The entire city was like a Gothic work of art. Through the secretary of the Lithuanian embassy in Prague, I was put in contact with a group of old plane enthusiasts They promised to find me some old planes so that I could film them in flight. I was met by Eva and the cameraman Jakub and his soundman Peter. We could not film the flying scenes because the pilot was unavailable that day. I was only going to be in Prague for 2 days, so I began to be nervous. What if the weather were bad the next day? What if the pilot couldn't fly? All these questions were crucial. We went to film the city itself. I gave the cameraman photographs that my father had taken in 1934, and he was able to find the exact spots from where my father had taken the shots. It was magical. The Charles Bridge, ever so beautiful. I thought of how many people had crossed that bridge since then, how many lives had passed over it. The people in my father's pictures were long gone. New people walked over it every day, keeping their memories of its charm. We found the street where my father had worked at the Lithuanian legation. We filmed the museum and the fountain where my father had stood with a diplomat. It began to rain, and I began to worry about the next day. July 10th dawned clear and beautiful. I could hear the bells of the many beautiful Gothic churches early in the morning, and I felt it was a good sign. I asked for 2 cameramen, one to film the plane and the other to film the actual flight. We drove outside the city to a small airport. There was no one there. I thought the pilots would not come, but then they all appeared, and suddenly I began to realize that my dream was coming true. The pilot, Yaroslav Klaczek, was a very seasoned pilot. I was told he had been a colonel in the army and used to fly MiGs. He tested the plane, hardly a MiG, rather a French 1914 fighter. It was a very pretty plane, but so fragile looking. After some deliberation as to what to do and checking out the planes, they asked for directives from me, the director. Not knowing at all what to tell them, I just said to film takeoffs and landings and lots of clouds. So up they went. It was wonderful. The little plane soon became just a small dot in the heavens. As it circled above us, I truly understood how unbelievably dangerous and arduous my father's flight had been. 1,600 kilometers in a small open biplane, winter, snow, pelting rain. Colonel Klaczek then took up the cameraman Jakub, and they disappeared again. After a while they returned, and the second plane went up with the second cameraman, Radek. They now filmed the first plane in flight. The clouds were building, and one plane went up a third time with Radek to film only clouds. Radek had no goggles against the wind, but took some magnificent shots. When they landed, he said that he thought his eyes would pop out of his head due to the wind. By that time it was dark, and the clouds were ominous, and it began to rain. They dragged the very light planes into the hangar so they would not blow away. We all stood around and talked and had some beer. I climbed into the plane and again was amazed at its smallness. There were only 5 dials and 1 handle for controlling the plane. How had my father done it? July 11th had been a wonderful day. All had fallen into place: the pilots, the planes, the cameramen, the equipment, and most importantly the weather, sun and dramatic clouds. I was told that Hollywood sometimes spent days waiting for just the right weather, and I had succeeded in only 1 day to accomplish everything. On July 12th, after a nice lunch, I said goodbye to Eva and to Prague, and off I went to Lithuania. I went to Aleksotas Airport in Kaunas, where my father had landed in 1934. There, a similar situation awaited me, meaning I had to find cameramen, planes, and pilots. The president, Algimantas Gentalis, arranged a plane for me. The pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Eugenius Raubitskas, took me up in it just to fly over the city and look over areas we might want to shoot. I was a bit nervous. The plane was enclosed, but very tiny, a two-seater, and when I looked down, all I saw was space and some rooftops far below. But I was a pilot's daughter, and I bravely showed no fear. Another pilot, Vladas Drupas, an amazing man, who was already over 80, had gone up and was doing loops in his plane. We later used that footage in the film. I landed and met everyone. They knew why I was there and were very friendly and accommodating. My cameraman, Vytautas Radzevičius, went up and shot some footage of Kaunas so that we could depict my father's landing. As with the Czechs, we later talked and had some champagne to celebrate another successful day of shooting. It was 22 years after my father's death that I was able to recreate his flight. For many years before his death, he had said that he wanted to be buried next to his mother in Lithuania. After my father died, I took his ashes back to Kaunas in 1987. My uncle arranged the Mass and the funeral. When we came to the Church of the Resurrection, Prisikėlimo bažnyčia, I learned that that was the little church where my parents had been married 48 years before. As the procession went down the quiet gravel path of the cemetery, children and relatives carrying flowers, the deep basso voice of the singer rising through the park-like cemetery, I thought how strange. My father had achieved his dream of becoming a pilot, then had been forced to leave his country, and had never flown again. And now he had taken his final flight and had come home.
Visi susirinkusieji. Šiandien mes laidojame mano tėvelį Julių Kumpiką. Nors jisai ir iškeliavo iš šitos Lietuvos, bet jis visuomet labai mylėjo savo kraštą. Ir jis visą laiką norėjo grįžti. Ir jis, nors kai buvo labai jaunas, jo viena svajonė buvo būti lakūnu, jis to lakūnu pasidarė. Paskui, žinoma, jo gyvenimas pasikeitė, jis iškeliavo labai toli, bet jis niekad neužmiršo savųjų, neužmiršo savo krašto. Ir už tai jis paprašė manęs, jo vienturtės duktės, jį sugrąžinti čia. Ir aš tai padariau.
Mūsų brolis Julius Kumpikas, gimęs 1910 metais, mirė prieš 2 metus, sulaukė 75 metų. Jo paskutinė valia, paskutinis noras buvo būti palaidotam šalia motinos, kurią jis labai mylėjo ir motina jį taip pat mylėjo. Iš pat jaunų dienų buvo energingas, sūnus ir labai mėgo visur dalyvauti, visus žemės ūkio darbuose dalyvauti, vėliau tėvui dirbtuvėse padėti, vėliau savarankiškai gyvendamas, paskiau tarnaudamas kariniai tarnybai, mechaniku tarnavo, draugavo su aviatoriais ir jo svajonė buvo tapti lakūnu. Paskiau tarnaudamas užsienio reikalų ministerijai, jis tarnavo kurį laiką Pragoje, ten įsigijo lėktuvą, išmoko, gavo piloto diplomą ir pirmas Lietuvoje turėjo savo nuosavą lėktuvą ir parskrido į jo Lietuvą. Paskiau, aišku, privačiam žmogui išlaikyti lėktuvą tai neįmanoma, todėl perleido civilinės aviacijos draugijai ir paskiau tarnavo įvairios įstaigose. Padavus Vilnių 39 metais tapo, buvo transporto skyriaus vedėjų, taip pat iki karo pabaigos liko likimas taip susiklostė, kad iškeliavo į Jungtinės valstijas ir ten su šeima, su dukrele Giedre ir žmona Izabelė gyveno. Ir, žinoma, sunkiai dirbo ir per ilgą laiką, sulaukęs jau 75 metų amžiaus, sunkiai susirgo ir ten ir mirė. Bet jo pageidavimas buvo, paskutinis pageidavimas buvo grįžti į tėvynę, būti palaidotam prie motinos. Šiemet jį prie motinos karsto galvūgalio ir laidojame. Tebūnė jam lengva šita mūsų tėvynės Petrašiūno kapinių žemelė, kur jo motina ilsis ir giminės.
Žmogaus širdis visada išsiilgusi grožio, gėrio. Žmogaus širdis nori daug ką gyvenime pamatyti, patirti ir išbandyti. Bet turbūt būna didžiausias džiaugsmas, kai nelaimėje sulaukia kito žmogaus geros širdies, nuostabių žodžių, užuojautos. Ir rodos, kai pavasarį tas pro sniegą prasikala pirmas gėlytės žiedelis. Rodos, koks jis nuostabus, juk po tokių speigų, taip greitai dar saulei, neįkaitinu žemės, dar sniegui nenutirpus, kaip pasirodo tas pirmas žiedelis. Jis rodos ir gležnus, bet kartu koks jis galingas, nugali tuos šalčius, nugali viską. Lygiai taip ir žmogaus gyvenime. Žmogus daug ką patiria. Jis iš pradžių būna kūdikį tuo gležnus, tarsi tas gležnutis pro snygą prasikali žiedelis. Bet palaipsniui jis išauga į tikrą augalą, galingą. Ir žiūrėk, atėjus rudeniui, pradeda byrėti jo žiedai. Ir žmogaus gyvenimas ir panašus į tą nuostabų pavasarį, į tą darbymečio vasarą ir atėjus rudeniui laimimas.